Welcome to History Today. Episode 1, Joliet Rocked by the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This podcast is in no way a representation of everything that was going on in our country at the time. It is a capsule of what happened in response to one event. It is also not a commentary on political content. It is the report of the event.
We must set the stage. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1942. He was part of a strict religious family who taught that we should love everyone. There should be no discrimination and no racism, and everyone should be able to live peacefully, being who they are, because we are all God's children. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up to be a peaceful man who was highly educated and a fantastic motivational speaker. He never instigated riots. There were others who fought against discrimination, who preferred to use a more violent technique. Martin Luther King did not advocate violence. He was a black man trying to popularize unpopular ideas, to make people see that there was another way and that all human beings were human and should be treated as such. We all needed to march together to love everyone. He was larger than life. He was going to change the world. To some, he was going to heal the rift between black and white. Equality would reign apparent. He was larger than life, and then... We'll be right back to History Today after a word from this very important sponsor.
Check out these great programs coming up soon at the Joliet Public Library. The Poetry Writing Workshop, Adults. Join Poet Laureate of Joliet for workshops to spark creativity and new ideas. Open to English and Spanish speakers. Fresh content only, no prior work reviewed. The Self-Love session will be on Thursday, February 5th, and Love Languages will be on Wednesday, February 19th at our Ottawa Street branch. The Home session will be Wednesday, March 5th, and the Food section will be Wednesday, March 19th, both at our Black Road branch. How does the space industry impact millions every day? Adults. The space race began decades ago as a competition between two superpowers, but there are 90 nations in space now. Join John Cilio as he highlights the global space race. This is a virtual program that you can sign up for on our website at jolietlibrary.org. It will take place on Thursday, February 13th from 6 to 7 p.m. Harry Potter Trivia. Adults. Trivia Night is back with a Hogwarts theme. Test your knowledge, represent your house, and compete for prizes. This is on Tuesday, February 18th from 6 to 8 p.m. at our Ottawa Street branch.
He was larger than life, and then... On the morning of April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel and was brutally assassinated by the gunshot of a lunatic. This assassination caused problems that were not seen up to this point in any other attempt on the life of a public servant. In major cities all over the United States, there were riots, fires, and deaths. Violence, the thing that King strove to veer away from. In retaliation of the death of a peaceful negotiator, the city of Joliet seemed to be set ablaze, as were many other cities all over the United States. News didn't travel as far or as quickly as it does now. But it traveled quickly enough, and as it did, fighting and riots broke out in the major cities everywhere. The man who was going to lead his followers to the promised land had been killed. People were grief-stricken, sad, and scared about what would happen. And would there be anyone that could pick up the pieces of the doctor's campaign against racism? Even in Joliet, Illinois, on the evening of April 4th, riots broke out on South Chicago Street. Windows were broken, fighting broke out. People in that neighborhood robbed businesses that were lined up and down South Chicago Street. Houses on either side of the street were burned. The police came in wearing riot gear, seemingly making the situation worse, but citing that they were there to maintain peace. The fire department did the best they could, but in the end, the area was in ruins. At some point during the revolt, some decision had to be made regarding the life of the city. How do we keep the violence from spreading? Can martial law be invoked? Can those that misbehave be arrested? Can the bridges be raised so the violence can't travel across the river, while also keeping the curious bystanders away? There was no dress rehearsal for this kind of chaos. April 5th, 1968, was the first mention of King's death in the Joliet newspaper. The article was a peaceful-sounding article concerning mostly a schedule for speakers for a memorial for Dr. King that was to be at Joliet Central High School the following Sunday. Some of those present at that memorial may have heard him speak in Joliet in June of 1965, when he addressed a rally at Memorial Stadium instructing the 2,000 people present to live as brothers or perish as fools. However, in a subsequent story, the same day the newspaper reported the violence that was happening in large cities all over the United States in response to King's death. Arsons, shootings, rock throwing, and looting ensued in Memphis, Tennessee, and Washington, D.C. The Michigan governor of that time sent 300 National Guardsmen into Detroit to try to control the violence there. Guardsmen from Joliet were ordered into the streets of Chicago after arsons and attacks. Many of these locations were ordered to be areas of states of emergency: San Francisco, California, Denver, Colorado, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Tallahassee, Florida, to name only a few. One community leader mirrored King's idea with the statement, "There will be fighting in the streets as long as there is fighting in our hearts." Joliet was no exception. On Friday, April 5th, 1968, it was reported by the Joliet paper that windows were smashed on East Jefferson Street, on South Chicago Street, Scott Street, and McDonough Street on the east and southeast sides of town. On Saturday, after the assassination, Joliet was given a curfew because of the vandalism, looting, and throwing of rocks. The curfew went from 10 p.m. until 6:30 a.m. 100 state troopers were sent to assist Joliet officers. Firefighters were forced to stop the efforts to control the blazes on South Chicago Street because of the number of people shouting and throwing rocks and other debris at them. After midnight, the disturbances were under control, according to police accounts. But alas, service at gas stations, taverns, and public transportation was halted until the riots really did conclude. The curfew lasted for a total of 6 nights, with store closures that were spread over Joliet, Rockdale, Lockport, and Crest Hill. On April 12, 1968, the curfew was lifted for all townships and villages surrounding Joliet, and all National Guard troops were released from duty. The memorial service was Sunday, April 7th. Because of this, all businesses were closed on that day. However, on Monday, a curfew at 8 p.m. was imposed, which was not lifted until 5 a.m. on Wednesday. During this time, police and fire departments battled further violence and arson all over the city of Joliet. Here are a few statements from people who witnessed parts of the 1968 riots in Joliet. They will not be identified by name. I was married by then and living in the north suburbs, but my mom and brother still lived on the corner of Richards and First Avenue. My brother sat on the porch all night with a baseball bat and saw crowds going down Richards, but had no problem. Mom moved shortly after that. It was a very sad time in the whole country. I was a junior at Joliet Catholic High School, half-days at Joliet Central for shop class. I remember sitting at one of the printing presses when I got a tap on the shoulder, and when I turned around, my father was there. Like any teenager, I was so embarrassed. He says, "You're coming home with me right now. They're having riots in the main building." So I left school and went home and stayed home for 4 days from the public high school. It was a very scary period because friends you had seemed to walk away from you during all this tension. It was very sad, scary, and deplorable. It's amazing how human beings can treat one another. I was working at the grocery store on South Chicago Street. They set the store on fire with me and the stock boy inside. We hid in the refrigerator until 6 cops in riot gear got us out. They put me in the back of a police car on the floor and put a blanket over me. There was glass everywhere. It was a horrible time. I can remember my dad not coming home for 3 nights of the firefighting during the riots. The bridges were raised at night, plus I could look out the front yard towards downtown, and the skies were an orange glow all night for 3 days. On that night, Dad had to mail something important and thought it was best that we go to the main post office on Scott Street. As we crossed the Jefferson Street Bridge, we saw a lot of people in the street running in between cars carrying what looked like 2x4s. We got down Jefferson to turn on Scott Street by the old Herald News building in time to see 2 men smashing out the windows of our eye doctor's office 4 doors down from that corner. Dad floored the Mercury, got to the post office, ran to drop the letter in the box, and got us out of the area as fast as he could. I remember him running a few red lights. By the time we got to the Sears building, he realized that all of the bridges were up, and we couldn't get back across the canal to go home. We ended up on Collins Street all the way to the old swing bridge in Lockport before we could cross back over the canal. My sister was coming into town on the train the night MLK was killed and the riots were starting. I had my radio on and picked her up at the train station and headed west across the Cass Street Bridge. I got on Jefferson Street and they announced on the radio that they were raising all of the bridges to stop traffic from coming into the east side to try to control the crowds. There were fires burning everywhere. The city was under martial law for about a week. Citizens weren't allowed to have firearms outside of their houses. Gasoline was not allowed in portable containers. Those on the street after 8 p.m. had to be going to work or home from work. Yet several nights straight, the sky on the south end of town glowed red with fires. I turned 18 the day after MLK was assassinated. I remember the way things were in Joliet and other parts of the country. The riots were over and life tried to return with some sense of stability. Much of the damage sat unrepaired for decades. Many of the houses and buildings in that area that had been burnt were bulldozed but never rebuilt. There were fires and looting in other parts of Joliet, Crest Hill, and Lockport, but none of those destroyed an entire neighborhood and business district. It seemed that King had wasted his peaceful words. The point had been missed.
This podcast was brought to you by the Joliet Public Library Digital Media Studio in conjunction with the Joliet Public Library Local History Room. Also, a large thank you goes to the Social Studies National Honor Society of Joliet West High School, who aided with the research for this project. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please contact Anneta Drilling at 815-846-3112 or email her at adrilling@jolietlibrary.org.